Is now 10, and she says he's doing as well as can be expected under the circumstances. He lives with a foster family.
Yeah, the story tragic on so many sides. I'm joined tonight by the psychologist and director of the Berlin-based child protection NGO Innocence in Danger. It's good to have you with us. Julia von Weiler, I want to ask you, Julia, we were talking earlier about what happens to children who are in these situations. This young boy, we understand he's now about 10 years old. I mean, will he ever recover from this? Can we talk about him one day having a normal life?
Sure, he can. But his life will never be as it could have been if that didn't happen. So child sexual abuse changes the future of a child. But they call themselves survivors because they're strong, and they did survive. He did survive the worst of it already. The torture, the selling, the prostitution, the fact that his mother does not protect him, that his father obviously
was also one of the rapists,
exactly,
right?
yes, she was a perpetrator, and she was a sadistic perpetrator. So actually today she did him a favor in a way, because she accepted the sentence right away in court still, and she said, I want to give him a sign. And one of the signs that children need is that the offender takes responsibility, which they rarely do. Usually they sort of cry about themselves.
Is the 10-year-old, is he looking for a sign from his mother, despite the fact that she is also a perpetrator?
Sure he is. He still loves his mom. He probably still misses her. Children told me, everything would be fine if he or she would just stop doing that. I love my dad, I love my mom, I don't want to be separated from them. So we need to be aware that he's...
Well, he hinted at abuse, right?
Yeah.
And what did people not recognize the signs? I mean, what happened? Do we know?
I think that it's, we don't want to know. We, as a teacher, as a neighbor, as whoever, I don't want to be aware of the fact that child sexual abuse happens right in my neighborhood. Not in my watch, not on my street, not in my building, not in my school. It's always somewhere else. But it's not. It's right next to us. So we need to be aware that it does happen amongst us, that we know victims, and that's what makes it so difficult. We know offenders. If we know victims, we know offenders.
When you say we know offenders, there are countries, societies around the world where sexual offenders are put on lists and it's made public. That is not necessarily the case here in Germany. Do you think, though, that the innocent are as protected as they should be in this country?
No, they're not, but they're also not protected as they should be in those countries where the offenders are put online, because we need to be aware that in those cases we're only talking about sentenced offenders, and we know that only a tiny fraction of offenders is ever put to trial. So you have all these others still around, and so if everybody focuses on the one who's put online, I as an offender have it really easy to access children.
What about the dark net and child pornography? We understand there were videos made of this boy being raped. They're out there somewhere, we assume. And none of this, or this would not have been possible in its severity had there been no dark net.
Right. The internet, digital media and the internet really changed the dynamics of child sexual abuse. We have child sexual abuse images being created now. We have something like live stream child sexual abuse, where I sit in front of a computer and direct what's going on somewhere else in the world. And we need to be aware that the spreading of these images really affects survivors. And we were part of an international study conducted with survivors of these crimes, and these survivors tell us, you need to be aware that these images out there hurt us in a very bad way. You need to be aware that we need your help, and that society needs to change laws also.
Well, who needs to shut down these, these live streams and these sources of pornography? Who do you think is responsible for taking these images down?
I think that law enforcement is responsible. I think that governments are responsible.
But it's proliferating, though.
I know it is, but then, today we have to, these industries can do so many things. And I know, for example, one of the giants, Google, is doing great stuff when it comes to trying to detect child sexual abuse images. But I do believe Google could do so much more. And I do believe if governments would sort of work together and really confront the issue, we could make a difference. And one of the differences that all governments could make would be to put law enforcement in the right spot to be able to do their work, which means more manpower and better technology.
Well, Julia van Weiler, as I said earlier, you're doing an angel's work out there protecting children with the child protection NGO Innocence in Danger based here in Berlin. Julia, thank you.
Thanks.
Chinese censors have banned the release of Christopher Robin, a new film adaptation about Winnie the Pooh. Now, it's not the first time that the fictional teddy bear has run into trouble in China, where he's increasingly becoming a symbol of resistance. Well, for more, we want to bring in our social media editor tonight, Liz Xu. Liz, it's good to see you. Who would have thought that we would be talking about Winnie the Pooh this way? I mean, what exactly happened? Why was the new Winnie the Pooh film banned?
Well, Brett, we don't know exactly. Chinese authorities are not giving us the exact reason. So there's a lot of speculation online. One reason could be the fact that China has a quota for international films that can be imported into the country every year. So maybe this film, Christopher Robin, just didn't make the cut. But then there's another theory that is actually more popular on the internet. People believe that the film has been banned because there are many people online who often compare the appearance of Winnie the Pooh to that of the Chinese President Xi Jinping. And in fact, Brent, this is not something that started this year. This is something that has been around for quite a while. In fact, it all started with this meme here. So a direct comparison between Xi Jinping and Obama. And on the other side, you have Winnie the Pooh and his friend Tigger there. So since then, memes like this have been continuing to circulate online, also often used to criticize President Xi Jinping. And even now, when news outlets are trying to report about this ban, they are running into trouble in China. For example, the CNBC correspondent says, when we just did the President Xi versus Winnie the Pooh story, our China-based folks told us that suddenly our show blacked out on television there. But Rand, we also have to be fair and say that the character of Winnie the Pooh has not been banned in China. In fact, if you're a fan, you can buy something like a T-shirt with that character on it, and there's no problem with that.
And what about social media users? I mean, how are they reacting online to, the banning of the Pooh?
Well, it's difficult for the ones that are in China because since last year, even words like Winnie the Pooh or the image of that character are partly being censored on Chinese social media. So there's one user, for example, on Weibo, which is the Chinese equivalent of Twitter. He's complaining about that. He says, I'm speechless. What did I do? Why did you take down my WeChat account? Now, WeChat is like WhatsApp. He says, please don't tell me it's because I explained to someone why Winnie the Pooh has been denied release in China. Now, meanwhile, in Taiwan, the foreign ministry is weighing in on this. I'm using an image here of their mascot, Owlbear, saying Taiwan's Owlbear is dismayed at the ban slapped on his cousin Winnie's latest film by censors in China. Make no mistake, all bears are created equal in Taiwan, and Disney's Christopher Robin is screening nationwide.
Yeah, you would think
all bears are created equal.
All bears are created equal. You would think that Xi Jinping would have, thicker skin. After all, he does get along with Donald Trump. Liz Xu, thank you very much for giving us the latest on Winnie the Pooh. All right, the day is nearly done, but as ever, the conversation continues online. You'll find us on Twitter, either at DW News or Brent Goff TV. Don't forget to use that hashtag today. And remember, no matter what happens between now and then, tomorrow is another day. We'll see you then, everybody.
A limited number of religious students in Israel are exempt from military service, only though if they report to authorities and prove their status. Protesters are also furious at a new bill that cuts funding for religious colleges that failed to meet their enlistment quotas. Just gone at 5:30 a.m. here in Moscow. That's it from myself and the team here for this hour. Join us in 35 minutes for the latest news headlines.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome aboard.
America was never great. It was founded on the rape and the murder.
Nothing changed. So we setting up our own response to these situations that we're dealing with.
People get shot every other day. Kids get shot. People kill each other. Black people kill each other.
There was just no way that people are going to just sit back and allow children to be shot down by law enforcement.
This country doesn't work for us. It doesn't function for us.
This can't be happening in America.
We come from the streets. We got to deal with rivals. It's a reason I have to ride like this. It's a reason.
Mai viste trenutka takve, vadim inna skaner. Taka mana hofta. Inna to mana hofta na hofta. Was me kunnen kroger tavattom, ramoi doorshurdom, grotsen baadimadom fasdaki.
Arsène was born on August the 8th, 2008. The day Georgia started a war against South Ossetia. Residential areas were shelled by howitzers and grabbed multiple rocket launchers. It was how Georgia tried to regain control over the rebellious republic. We were here at the height of that war, and we've returned after 10 years. We'll meet people whose stories we told, and we'll learn how their lives changed.
Saluma halma kostam roid tohash kuri mamr boshdi ordgi ostan tengstui nhacha damil dar sagdi gurat yulgar dest parx ma yulgar destait saxt moshinota ma afta bostan rutuma.
Здесь было очень много людей из окрестных улиц, потому что находиться дома было страшно. Такой был обстрел, страшный был обстрел. И даже здание наше было повреждено. Мы вынуждены были вот здесь развернуть. Вот, я говорю, здесь спала.
На дарже дону дини шуджуди бандar. Кую اخستیادی لگنه کوتیتای. من جرتوی دختر مدام ترس خفتی کوتو مخین.
Am tali dodíš, hogy nem.
Правда. Это кресло, да?
Вот здесь кресло. Да, у нас кресло оборудовано. Если бы пришлось принимать роды, мы бы здесь принимали роды. Но когда у него появились, тогда было тихо, да? Тихо было. Мы поднялись наверх. Вот на этой кровати лежала Шурена. Все было спокойно. И вдруг начался массированный обстрел. И мы прямо видели воздушный бой. Это грузинский самолет пролетел. И потом за ним российский самолет. Здесь никаких стекол не осталось. Все рушилось. Канонада и под канонаду ты здесь появился на свет.
Шурена, привет. Я обниму тебя. Ой, ты мой маленький такой, хорошенький. Помните ее? Конечно, помню. Как не помните ее? Вроде принимаем, а такой обстрел, такой ужас, такой. Прямо дрожим и вот так принимаем. Да, качались мы вот совсем на силу, вот прямо вот так.
Так что вот появилось дитя войны.
It wasn't the first military conflict between Georgia and South Ossetia. Things started to heat up in the late 1980s. The Soviet Union was falling apart, and the republics were striving for the right to self-determination. The nationalists even came up with a slogan, "Georgia is for Georgians." Schools were forbidden to teach in the Ossetian language. South Ossetia rebelled, declared independence, and war broke out. In 1992, the warring parties signed a peace accord, but failed to come to an agreement. Russia had brokered the peace talks. Since then, Russian peacemakers have been helping to keep order.
Мне очень больно сюда приходить, вспоминать все это. Молодые такие, 18-летние.
Там пару танков по нам бьет. Грузины. Там всех рас...
In 2008, Maya Bestayeva worked as a nurse at the Russian peacekeepers' base. It stood in the way of the Georgian army. The base came under massive shelling from the Georgians for many hours.
Справа и с левой стороны здесь спальные помещения для солдатиков. Вот здесь телевизор висел. И второй этаж развалился, и третий, естественно. Все расплавилось. Везде стреляли. Напротив меня находился плац, и вот этот плац была дорога смерти, можно сказать. И невозможно было его пересечь. Но я все равно несколько рейсов взяла туда-сюда, к раненым.
Май, уйди оттуда.
Всего раненых где-то под 50 было. А вот тяжело раненых мы загрузили в бронеурал и отправили в Владикавказ. В Владикавказе никто и не верил. До этого, пока не увидели, что действительно вот такой ужас, такие раненые страшные. Откуда, говорят, они взялись? Вот с Кинвали. Они не верили, что здесь война.
Maya was also seriously injured. She was unaware that reinforcements were fighting their way through to the peacekeepers and that her son was with the military. He would run into an ambush near the peacekeepers' base and be badly wounded. The peacekeepers couldn't hold the Georgian troops back for too long, and by the afternoon of August the 8th, Georgian tanks had already entered Tskhinval.
Две девочки пошли, и грузины танками на ней зашли, и головы даже как земляста.
We met Sazlan when he was 9. His house was hit by a shell which caused the walls to fall down and the roof to cave in.
Тогда все градами, гаубицы начали стрелять. Вот сюда как град.
Вот с этой стороны больше всех пострадал этот дом. Здесь был еще прибавлен к нему комната одна. И она была сильно разрушена, и мы его снесли. Как укоротили дом.
Sazlan's village came under shelling for a few days. After the war, there were no houses left undamaged here.
Там живут вот эти дети. Там снаряд. Папу ноги сломались.
Вот те дети, которые играли. Салондан işte montaj var. Монтаж, так вот уже подросток, конечно. Он тоже здесь играл. Вот и сестра ее, Алана.
А у него папа пострадал во время войны, да?
Да, он пострадал.
Ноги, да, пострадали? А как сейчас?
Сейчас он хорошо работает тоже, кормит свою семью.
The kids still go to play at the place that was once their home, even though a new house was built for their family.
Всем, у кого было разрушено дом, обвалился полностью, построили. Детский сад здесь отремонтировали, школу построили. Там вот так помогают тем, кто нуждается.
Sazlan and his parents managed to flee the village just in time and avoided the oncoming Georgian army. They didn't know the road was under the control of Georgian troops.
Фандаколку садастамат. Пастия гоппадакой что маташта мефс маркота нахвания фандакурашиди.
Thousands of civilians fled to Russia, but not everybody managed to get there unharmed. Many were killed on the way. The Ossetians were incapable of defending themselves on their own against the well-trained Georgian army. People died in Tskhinval. The peacekeepers were surrounded and couldn't help. Russia launched the operation of forcing Georgia to peace. The military were fighting their way through to relieve Tskhinval. Georgian President Mikhail Saakashvili claimed Russia had attacked Georgia.
My country is in self-defense against Russian aggression. Russian troops invaded Georgia. They've been bombing Georgia from numerous warplanes and specifically targeting civilian population.
Did you take a gamble? Your government launched its own attempt to retake South Ossetia.
We didn't. We didn't.
At the morning of the 8th, my wife calls me and says that they bombed a couple hundred meters away from her mother's house. I remember I was actually crying and afraid and thinking that if anything happens to my family, I'm going to kill Saakashvili. And I meant that.
We met Joe Mestas 10 years ago. He's an American who lives in Florida. His wife, Zhana, is Ossetian. In August 2008, she and her daughter were on holiday at her parents' place in South Ossetia.
Шло все к эскалации. 89-91 годы это было очень плохо. А то, что в 2008 году было, это уже дальше некуда. Бомбы и град. А следующее что было? Ядерное. Я знала, что подходит к концу что-то. А это, наверное, независимость или порабощение. Одно из них.
Saakashvili said that Russia attacked Georgia. Later you find out through the European Commission that in fact it was Georgia that attacked South Ossetia. It was not a...
Here the mainstream media, they reported that Russia started the conflict and said nothing about Saakashvili opening fire on the night of the beginning of the Olympics in Beijing. I talked to many people. I've posted many things on the internet, letting people know the truth about what really happened.
When I was in South Ossetia, there there were planes. They were dropping a bomb, and I was sleeping, and I ran to Mama, and then Mama grabbed me. We ran to the basement, and then they were shooting.
I don't remember much of it, but I know that I wouldn't want to sleep alone. There was this one window in my room that I used to sleep in. There was like a crack, and then like I would always remember, oh, that's from the war.
Sandra was afraid. She was saying, yeah, she was afraid that Saakashvili was going to be there and that he would send the soldiers after us. Every year when we went back for several years, she had those feelings. A couple of years after the war, I believe that eventually other countries would learn to recognize that Georgia was at fault in this war, especially after the European Commission came out and said that Georgia started the war. I thought for sure that other countries would follow suit with Russia to recognize the independence of South Ossetia, and I was very disappointed that they didn't.
Max Kaiser's Financial Survival Guide. When customers go by, you reduce the price. Didn't help? Well, reduce it lower. That's undercutting. But what's good for food market is not good for the global economy.
When old truths seem wrong, when old rules just don't hold, and a new world is yet to shape out, disdain becomes the etiquette, and engagement equals betrayal. When so many find themselves worlds apart, we choose to look for common ground.
People have to understand that when you're attacked so many times, brutally attacked, and people murdered, how can you expect a republic to go back to those people open arms? You can't.
Dystem, Chezorbo, dystem, Swelet, Rzeczka, Morwistan, Vladikavkazna, Menachedek, Bozza, dystem. Małżio chamachste teroidytty, chamachste teroidytty, mamottama kudochustaiką midernyn nolodis. Kutter teo I verstystem, menachip odwol menachistystem, humbotystem.
Iedereen van die bloggers die China mogen hier met gisteren met ons dat worden heel veel met al gezien met al gezien. Maar je gisteren dat hij ook het dan gewoon mogen herinneren dan in ieder geval kunnen gaan je wel hier doen dat in nou vast te staan. Gelukkig is dat nou die stoel.
Nol worstydysty gurziekta. Oftedom laut medom stimoshinor poszedzenis medoma okandzystem.
Kurja gofte jak ukrył migana no to na fiesta. O ma sahiz do grofta i do mostu. Ma tylko kosztem o dala malaps.
Dala odwalaj mena hajor. Służy. منا خجر الكاوين شما يزون ما قبولوش ران ما قبولو توقف دلتتاي يسر موس ما كسر اللي برخي ما تحكى شو رقصتا ما زي كزتاين وي كزتاين ما قبول البو خستي ما وي فيخستا ودايخ ما خو بخورتاين وشران.
Nasirat later related what happened. Her son had found out that his parents had been captured and he came to rescue them. It took the Russian army a few days to force the Georgians to retreat. Many Georgians who had been living in Ossetia left for Georgia with the military.
Грузинская армия разрушила здесь все. Даже дома своего народа, которые здесь жили. Они же не знали, где они. Бомбили туда-сюда. После войны они сами тоже уехали, оставили свои дома. До сих пор они спрашивают здесь с наших знакомых, как это как наши дома. Если как все наладится, мы сразу приедем.
Serovani in Georgia was built as a special refugee settlement for those who came from South Ossetia. Cookie-cutter houses accommodate 2,000 people. Most Serovani residents refer to South Ossetia as occupied territory. For them, it's Georgian land. Elnara fled to Georgia with her children. Her house was burnt down, so she's got nowhere to go back to. Elnara's granddaughter was born in Serovani. She's never been to South Ossetia and only heard about it from her grandma.
ძალიან კარგი ურთიერთობა ჰქონდა ყველასთან. ერთმანეთის გვერდით ვიყავით ყველა, ძალიან პატივცემდით ერთმანეთს. ომის დროს უკვე ყველაფერი შეიცვალა, რა თქმა უნდა. დაიხოცა ადამიანები, დაინგრა სახლები. მე რა თქმა უნდა დაიცალა სოფელი, ყველას ბავშვები, ყველა გავიდნენ, ქალი, კაცი, ყველა გავიდა. აი ეს სურათებია, რაც დაგვრჩა ჩვენ მამა და დედა და ეს ალბომი. დანარჩენი დაიწყო ეგ სახლთან ერთად ყველაფერი. რა თქმა უნდა, მოგწონს იმასთან შედარებით, რაც ქონდა ის არა, მაგრამ ხო ნორმალური ცხოვრება გვაქვს, ცხოვრობთ კარგად, ვჭიდათ წნარად. მე არ ვიცი, ვინ არის დამნაშავე, მაგრამ მთავარია ის, რომ იყოს ახლა მშვიდობა. რომ ვიცხოვროთ ერთად ბედნიერად. ყველა ერი მიყვარს მე. რუსი იქნება, ოსი იქნება, ყველა ჩემთვის ეს იყო, იმიტომ რომ ყველგან არის კარგი და ცუდი, ხო? რა თქმა უნდა, მშვიდობა გვინდა, დაბრუნება გვინდა ჩვენ სახლებში, ჩვენს მიწაზე. რა თქმა უნდა, ეს არის საქართველო, საქართველოს მიწა, ქართველები ცხოვრობდნენ, ოსები, რა თქმა უნდა, ხო, ყველა რჯული ცხოვრობს იქ. მაგრამ ტერიტორია არის საქართველოს.
Становись. Равняйсь. Смирно. Приказываю выступить на охрану государственной границы Республики Южная Осетия. Вид пограничного наряда «Дозор». С 9:00 до 18:00. Участок ответственности отделения Цхинвал. Службу несем путем осмотра местности, заградительного забора и информационных знаков.
The construction of this fence between Georgia and South Ossetia started straight after the war. However, the borderline hasn't been fully fenced. The Ossetians asked for Russian border guards to be stationed along the border to help with security.
Часто нарушают граждане Грузии государственную границу, это ввиду незнания прохождения государственной границы, либо умышленно они нарушают. Бывают и пастухи, бывает и контрабанда там.
Заря и Береза, прием.
На приеме Заря.
343, как принял?
Принял, до связи.
Грузины никак не контролируют данную границу, так как это не в их интересах ее охранять, потому что охрана данной границы со стороны Грузии – это фактическое признание независимости Южной Осетии, поэтому для Грузии этой границы в принципе нет.
The borderlines were defined by rather old maps, which just didn't reflect current reality. In Helchua, the border cut the village in two, so some of the inhabitants remained in South Ossetia, while 22 people found themselves living in no man's land. Since then, they've been living between two checkpoints. They're not allowed into Georgia, and they need a special pass to enter South Ossetia. This border checkpoint has been set up specially for them.
Когда захочешь, не проедешь, не заедешь. Это разве что за жизнь? Даже не знаю. В тюрьме человека, когда посадишь, знаешь, сколько год дадут. Здесь даже не знаем, сколько год будем так.
У нас очень трудно жить. Пропуск по дням. Утром рано с 8 до 10 пропуск, с 2 до 7. Вот так. К нам детей не пускают. Вот. Прямо. Вот там грузинский пост. А вот за постом живем мы. У меня есть своя тропинка, обход через вот этот пост. Каждый раз вот так иду домой. Вот эти дома все, которые...
Those stranded in no man's land have been promised that they'll be allocated new houses and be moved to South Ossetia. However, that promise was given 6 years ago when the fence was built. Destroyed during the war. Sazlan School was also badly damaged. 10 years ago, it seemed to us that it would be impossible to rebuild the place.
Когда грузины пришли, стреляли по школу, по крышу. Вон туда попал град.
Как только война закончилась, начали ремонтировать все школы, не только нашу школу, а все остальные школы. Как видите, намного улучшилось.
Класс. Когда стреляли, дети были в классе, учились. Сюда попал уже миномет. И 3 детей умерли.
Это у нас 3-й этаж, который подвергся самым сильным разрушениям. Его хорошенько восстановили. Но плюс еще прибавили ему спортивный комплекс вот с окна видно.
As a child, Sazlan was fascinated by clay modeling. He used to make models of animals and superheroes. As he grew older, he didn't abandon his hobby. Even though he graduated last year, they still keep his models on display. Not the ones he made as a child, but his more serious work.
Я сделал всех наших выдающихся писателей, поэтов. Я закончил школу, поступил в университет во Владикавказе. Я хочу там скульптором стать, конечно. Больше всего бюст людей мне очень. В детстве больше всего тянуло к животным. Но сейчас уже, так сказать, подрос и на более сложные детали хочу. Ну, конечно, я тоже сюда хочу вернуться. Там, здесь меня тоже надеются, типа, сделать там новые эти разные памятники, скульптуры, изменишь, кажется, наш город лучше.
Skinval Centre has really changed. Most of the buildings were reconstructed, but many were torn down and rebuilt from scratch. Russia helped to rebuild the destroyed republic and was the first nation to recognize South Ossetia's independence. Russia now helps to keep the peace. A military base was built in Skinval. It's where Maya Bestayeva serves in the medical corps.
Здравствуйте, ребята. Что эти вопросы есть? Никаких жалоб нет на здоровье, на медицину, именно на столовую. Все хорошо? Если что, знаете, к кому обращаться? Конечно, я очень сильно изменилась. Постарела резко. Со здоровьем очень большие проблемы после ранения. Пускай другие разбираются в этом, кто был виноват в этой войне. Простые люди точно не виноваты. Это я знаю душой, чувствую. Потому что грузины и осетины были не враги. Не знаю там, что произошло. Одна кровь, можно сказать.
When Shorena was hiding with her son in the basement of a maternity home, the Georgian army entered her village. Shorena's husband went off to fight, and her parents were left alone in their house. Shorena's husband died shortly after the war, so Arsene has no memory of his dad. Shorena remarried and gave birth to a daughter, and another baby's on the way. The family's poor, so Arsene makes his own toys. His favorites are a wooden machine gun and a sniper rifle.
أنا جو pogranicznik tamten ma pandy.
تاسس مادامو بونه خشتای.
إيه. كلنا تاسس. كو خشتات خل داره جفت الجستم.
The way to the United States is dangerous for most of the illegal immigrants.
¿Cómo ha sido el viaje en la Bestia?
Bastante duro. Siempre tratamos de ubicarnos adentro en las góndolas que son destapadas por él.
Many of them look for refuge in the so-called sanctuary sites that refuse to share information about undocumented migrants with federal authorities.
Ahorita las personas crean como un círculo alrededor de la persona que a lo mejor pueda ser deportada, como para protegerla.
What are their options to stay in the country with Donald Trump in the White House?
¿Cómo van los republicanos dejar 12 millones de inmigrantes indocumentados hacerse ciudadanos americanos cuando todo el mundo sabe que 80%...
Twitter is accused of double standards after banning an activist for offensive comments against black people, even though identical tweets against whites went unchallenged. In other headlines, InfoWars, one of the most popular and most controversial alternative news websites, has been banned by leading social media platforms for what they see as hate speech. And ahead of a visit by the International Chemical Weapons Watchdog to the English town of Amesbury next week, the media continues to speculate on a poisoning case, claiming the UK has asked Russia to extradite suspects. You can get the latest on all those stories on our website, rt.com. Stay with us now for Crosstalk, though, discussing the long-running Saudi bombardments of Yemen.
Hello and welcome to Crosstalk, where all things are considered. I'm Peter Lavelle. After 3 years of conflict, it has been estimated that out of a population of 27.4 million, 22.2 million people in Yemen are in need of humanitarian assistance. 4.5 million children and women are suffering malnutrition, while 2.9 million people are internally displaced. This is a humanitarian catastrophe by any measure. So why are the U.S. and UK so committed to the Saudi-UAE war on Yemen? crosstalking the tragedy known as Yemen. I'm joined by my guest, Mohammed Marandi in Tehran. He's a professor at the University of Tehran. In London, we have Charles Shoebridge. He is a security analyst and a former UK Army and counter-terrorism intelligence officer. And in Brighton, we cross to Catherine Shakdam. She is a senior analyst with Al Bayan Center. All right, crosstalk rules in effect. That means you can jump in anytime you want, and I always appreciate it. Let me go to Charles first. This war has been going on for 3 years. I gave some of the stats. I encourage our viewers to go to Doctors Without Frontiers and look at their site on Yemen. Much more detailed, much more gruesome, I would even say. What is the U.S. interest in this war against the country, the poorest country in the Middle East? What is the thinking behind British foreign policy supporting Saudi Arabia and the Emirates against Yemen?
I suspect on the one hand that you've got UK and the US seeing that to some degree, and we can come on to that later on, their national interests are aligned with those of Saudi Arabia, particularly against Iran, of course, in Yemen as elsewhere. And again, you have to question, and hopefully later in the program we will do that in more detail, as to why the UK and US always seem to see their interests as being in conflict with Iran in most instances. But also there's got to be a aspect of this which is based on commercial interests. Of course, Britain and America supply vast amounts of weaponry and other equipment to Saudi Arabia. The relationship with Saudi Arabia particularly, it's not just Saudi Arabia involved here as well, of course other Gulf states as well, all of which have very lucrative commercial contacts with Britain and the United States and indeed France. And there has been, certainly over the last few years, a tendency for, particularly the United Kingdom, that anything that Saudi Arabia supports, pretty much Britain and America are going to support also. And we have to remember just really how important this relationship, particularly with Saudi Arabia, is. If we think about Trump, we think about other government ministers in the United States and the United Kingdom, their first port of call when they've been put into office isn't their allies in Europe or the States often. It's usually going off to see two players, both of whom are vitally important to British and particularly American interests. One of those is Israel, the other one always Saudi Arabia. And so really I think this war is becoming increasingly an embarrassment, not just war, but the blockade and everything else that goes with it is becoming an embarrassment to Western leaders, as invariably parts of it creep into media coverage because there's been a near blackout, as we know, the last 3 years.
Creep.
But also they will continue to support it.
Catherine, let me go to you in Brighton. Okay, so we've got a little bit of the background, the reason why, if we can use that term, for the British and the Americans. So what does victory mean in Yemen for the Saudis and the UAE? Genocide? I mean, what do they hope to, what is the end goal here? Go ahead, Catherine.
Well, the end goal was basically the situation that we had prior to 2011, when the people decided to rise up against the then regime, whereas Saudi Arabia was in control of Yemen and Yemen's political future as well as economical future. And I think that this is what they're trying to do. They're trying to revert back to the situation that we had pre-2011, but it's not going to happen because people have learned that they have a right to political self-determination, and they understand today, the majority of Yemeni understand that Saudi Arabia is not there to promote a greater Yemen or even to promote a greater future for Yemen, but rather, to have yet another country, a client state that will remain forever tied up to Yemen. If I may, just very quickly, when we talk about, British and the US siding with Saudi Arabia because of the fear and animosity they have towards Iran, we need to be very careful here to understand that Yemen is a proxy only in the eyes of Britain and the US, because there is no Iranian influence. But Yemen represents geographically an advantage in that it's sitting on very important waterways, militarily and of course because of the oil route, which is why Britain and the US are interested in Yemen in the first place. It has really nothing to do with the fact that Iran has an eye on Yemen, but rather because of the geography and where Yemen is situated in relation to Iran and the rest of the Gulf countries. And I think it's an important point, because we need to stop this narrative that Iran, has an interest in trying to promote unrest in Yemen. That's not the case. If anything, Iran needs stability in the region to be able to itself, stabilize its own borders and everything else that goes with it.
I think that's, Catherine, I'm really glad you brought that up, because there is a self-determination issue in Yemen that is never brought up in the mainstream media. And Charles already brought up the issue that is always mentioned. I'm going to go to Mohammed now in Tehran. It's all Iran's fault as usual. I mean, pick the day of the week. It's Russia's fault or Iran's fault here. Now, I'm willing to agree that Iran may have some kind of involvement on some level now, but not in 2011. That was how it was sold, the Saudi intervention in the first place here. But it's always Iran's fault. It's a proxy war. It's far more than a proxy war, as Catherine has pointed out. Go ahead, Mohammed in Tehran.
Well, this is one of the excuses that Western countries and the Western media use in order to justify the crimes being committed by their governments. The Canadian government, the American, British, and French governments are involved in crimes against humanity. And they are just as guilty as Mohammed bin Salman and the Saudi regime in all this. Without them, he couldn't be carrying out these crimes. The Americans are providing all sorts of logistical support, so they need to justify it somehow. Obviously, for anyone who knows anything about what's going on, the Yemenis do not have the ability to have any meaningful contact with Iran. There's no way that the Iranians can help them in a meaningful way because they are completely surrounded. The Americans and the Saudis and others have laid siege on the country. They're preventing food from getting in. They're enforcing starvation. They've been doing this for years now. And the Western media, they call it a proxy war, or they try to somehow blame the victims, like in Gaza, in order to, again, justify their policies. But it's obvious that this country is surrounded. The overwhelming majority of the population is living in the areas controlled by the Ansarullah and their allies, the popular committees and so on. After all these years, after over 3.5 years, with all the foreign support, American support, European support, mercenaries from different countries, Blackwater, and an American and French official military presence on the ground, Sudanese mercenaries. After all, with all the money that the Saudis and the Emiratis are spending, if they cannot capture the capital of the country, that shows that it is the will of the people of Yemen that prevents them from doing so. That shows that the resistance against the Saudis and the Americans is a legitimate and popular resistance. But that's something that they don't want to see, because that makes CNN, that makes the New York Times, The Guardian, the BBC, all of them run against their own government. If they point these out, that humiliates their own government position.
Charles, I have noticed that what scant coverage there is on the cable stations, the Iran card is almost always played first, okay? And there isn't a willingness to admit that serious war crimes are being committed, and I'd like to point out that the Houthis also have been accused of that, in all fairness. But this is a very tragic conflict. What is the end game here? Because I mean, just reading the stats, I mean, this is a country, a humanitarian situation that is winding down, winding out of control in a very serious way. I mean, cholera, I mean, something that is virtually wiped out in the world has come back in a vengeance there. And there seems to be no outcry whatsoever from the media. I mean, it makes them culpable. Go ahead, Charles.
Or if there is outcry, as you've already kind of hinted at, it's at a humanitarian situation that seems to have risen out of nothing, that this is a famine, that there are hundreds of thousands of children not in education, that there is, as you say, for the second year running, now the danger of a cholera epidemic breaking out, as if this has got nothing to do with the fact that this war has been visited upon this people by Saudi Arabia and its allies. But particularly, of course, what's missing from the Western media coverage is that this war, this assault on this country, as you point out, one of the poorest countries on earth and facing terrible predicament for its people, that this assault on this country is enabled totally by Britain, America and France, particularly Britain and America, in supplying the weapons that are being used against the Yemeni people. And of course, study after study from independent organizations from monitoring groups, human rights groups, as well as the UN itself, have shown repeatedly that there has been almost no care taken to prevent civilian casualties. We're talking about the humanitarian situation that is largely been caused by the blockade that is in place, that is preventing medicines and foods arriving. As we speak, even fighting going on. Of course, the assault has been launched on the major Houthi-held port by the Saudis and the Emiratis, again with British and American and French, not only material cover by providing the materials, the logistical support, the intelligence, the refueling and arming capabilities, but the weapons themselves, but also diplomatic and propaganda cover. For example, it was Britain, France and America that blocked the Swedish initiative a few days ago to actually call a ceasefire, and that was actually virtually absent from UK and US media coverage. And one other aspect I would just quickly mention, what Catherine mentioned, and to support what she said, it's interesting about the Iran angle, as you mentioned, always being brought up, but in 3 years, no actual hard evidence has been shown whatsoever, even by those that claim that Iran is backing the Houthis, to prove that they are actually supplying
Charles, I'm
weapons.
going to jump in here, and we have to remember that in December of last year, the Pentagon admitted it had troops on the ground. We're going to go to a short break, and after a short break, that short break will continue our discussion on Yemen. Stay with RT.
The Americans are still in shock. They're still dealing with the psychological damage of 9/11. They still need enemies. They still don't justify it. They still are having troubles working through it. Meanwhile, the rest of the world is leapfrogging ahead.
A church secret indeed. Catholic priests accused of sexually abusing children can get away with it, quite literally.
I like to call this the geographic solution. So what the bishop needs to do then, he finds out that the priest is a perpetrator. He simply moves him to a different spot where the previous scandal is not known.
The highest ranks of the Catholic Church help conceal the accused priests from the police and justice.
Sua Santidad, en el caso Gracia, intentando influir a la justicia argentina. Expose the truth. Protect the children. Expose the truth.
Welcome back to Crosstalk, where all things are considered. I'm Peter Lavelle. To remind you, we're discussing the tragedy known as Yemen. Okay, let me go back to Catherine on Skype in Brighton. Well, as we've already pointed out in this program, and you put it quite definitively in the first part of the program, the people of Yemen do not want to be occupied. They've proven over the last 3 years to be quite resistant to that, even though the casualties are high in every single way. There has never been any solid documentation that Iran is helping militarily or in any kind of meaningful material way. So what is facing the Saudis and the UAE and the Emirates? I mean, it doesn't. Are they going to have a land invasion and occupy it? I mean, the people of Yemen have shown themselves to be quite resilient to the onslaught that they've experienced over the last 3.5 years. Go ahead, Catherine.
Well, yes. I mean, historically, Yemen was never invaded. Even the Ottoman Empire actually, gave up and allowed Yemen to have a great degree of autonomy. And it really goes to show that, the Saudi are not really good at brushing up on their history, bearing in mind that Yemen is actually their direct neighbor. Now, when it comes to, a military victory, I don't think it's going to happen because if the south of Yemen might actually develop and actually open it already kind of done it already, to open up itself to, the UAE or Saudi Arabia, I very much doubt that that the North will give up because, you know, they are very different people altogether. And for very obvious reason, they understand that any occupation by Saudi Arabia would mean an entire genocide for them because Saudi Arabia is very sectarian in its approach and has made sure that, you know, the Houthi, Ansar Allah, the resistance movement in general, and northern Yemen globally has been labeled under this, you know, this Shia title and therefore should be obliterated. We tend to forget this. You know, the Saudi are not just out there to gain victory. What they're trying to do is annihilate an entire people because of their religious standing, their religious belief, and their tradition. And, you know, forget a little bit about the civilian casualty and understand that they're not collateral damage. You know, the Saudi have architected this war to inflict maximum damage on civilians because he wants the people to rise up against the resistance movement, not understanding that the resistance movement in itself is made out of the people. The legitimacy that Ansar Allah has is given by the people of Yemen. It's not being created out of thin air. And therefore, a victory for the Saudi is, by definition, impossible. The people will not allow it. But in the meantime, we're facing a catastrophe of biblical proportion, because northern Yemen is being decimated for only one reason, is that these people decided to be free in their own land, in their own sovereignty. So the real question is, are we actually willing in Western countries to defend a nation such as Saudi Arabia and actually give up and forfeit our own rights to our own sovereignty and own democracy? Because this is what we're doing by allowing a country to unlawfully declare war on another in Yemen.
Right. Exactly. Let me go back to Mohammed in Tehran. I mean, considering we see some kind of peace overture process with North Korea about nuclear weapons, and then we kind of go on the other side of the world and we have Iran. And considering the cast of characters that surround President Trump, I'm not hopeful at all on what's going to happen when it comes to Iran. I have a distinct worry that they're going to use this humanitarian crisis, given the way the media works, is they're going to say this is Iran's fault because of Iran's involvement. And that's just another box that is checked in this agenda that looking at regime change in Iran, punishing Iran, more sanctions, et cetera, et cetera. And this is when they'll pull out the pictures. This is when they're going to have the crying mothers and the skinny babies. That's when they're going to start showing those pictures. They have them all saved up in archive, and that's when they're going to use it. That's my supposition, okay? Go ahead, Mohammed.
I think it's quite obvious that what is different in this part of the world is the Saudi-Israeli alliance and their relationship with the White House and the United States political regime in general.